Can dogs display a mix of fear and predatory behavior at the same time? I wanted to make another video reply within this conversation because I think this is a really interesting topic. So this commenter mentioned that their dog foster dog I think, is really hyper vigilant at night and high on the stress scale. And I made a video talking about dogs who are afraid of the dark, or dogs who seem to be more stressed in the dark. And then the commenter said that they think that there's predatory behavior involved, and that there's more wildlife activity where they are at night, and the scents may be stronger at night. And then I was like, oh, I wasn't even thinking about predatory behavior. So yes, that's a different response. I would take a different approach to that, to arousal brought on by predation than I would fear or anxiety, trauma. And so the commenter says, I think it's a mix of both. She's generally very hypervigilant, but the scents are probably a lot stronger at night. During the day, she definitely does go after scents, but it's not as big of a response. And this can be a confusing scenario because it feels like we should address the predation. And it may feel even like these are two totally separate silos. The fear is one piece, and then the predatory behavior is another piece. So let's unpack what's happening when we see this type of mix of behavior, because if we're not careful, we can end up trying to address predatory behavior when we should really be addressing fear, even when the predatory behavior is appearing. So fear and predation exist in very different parts of the brain. We are not actually going to see them appearing simultaneously. Stay with me here. So fear is a defensive mechanism. We're thinking about like the HPA axis, the amygdala. This is the type of stress response we're referring to when we talk about dogs climbing the stress scale. And predatory behavior is one of those nuances that I mentioned I was not covering in that previous video. When we're headed up toward that fight or flight response, more into that sympathetic nervous system, we actually see the digestive system, for example, like go offline. You don't need to eat a pizza while a lion is chasing you. But with predatory behavior, the goal is not survival. It's not defensive driven happening, within the sympathetic nervous system. It is about gaining resources like food, for example. We're talking more about like being driven by dopamine here. This is fun. This is rewarding. And so thinking about it in that way, these are two very separate things. But in real life, we may see them appear together, which can be confusing. Which do we address? How do we support this dog? So what I tend to see most often is that dogs who are displaying, especially this really big, over-the-top or ramped up predatory behavior, who have an underlying anxiety disorder, or I know they're experiencing fear as sort of the root of what is happening, we may see an escalation in that predatory behavior as essentially a displacement activity, as coping. That doesn't mean that the predatory behaviors we are seeing are motivated by fear, but more that this fear or anxiety sort of lowers the threshold for that behavior to be triggered, and that we may see more intensity in those behaviors. And so what I often see with my clients is that we focus on managing the predatory behavior like we would any other trigger, and then we address the stress levels, the fear, the anxiety, perhaps the frustration, and without touching predation, other than managing it, we see the intensity drop, the frequency of activation drop. And sometimes to the point that we don't actually need to do anything else around the predatory behavior. We might, in terms of like if we want to make sure that we're meeting certain needs for the dogs in their enrichment plan, or sometimes we still may need to do some collaborative work around predatory behavior. But a lot of times it goes from like this really high intensity, what seems like really high intensity prey drive, drops significantly just because we've addressed that anxiety and fear, which is why we were seeing such a heightened presentation of this predatory behavior versus the original assumption that this is a dog with high prey drive. If I am working with a dog who's experiencing hyperarousal, or they're experiencing frustration as one of those main emotions driving their trip up the stress scale, Sometimes I will begin addressing predatory behavior as part of their enrichment plan. I'll work it into like on-off switch games. We'll be doing like scent work. I'll do some of those things that can only benefit them in terms of their stress levels. Trying to stay away at first, at least away from activities that might bring them up and leave them there. So playing a lot of games like, let's say, flirt pole activities as on-off switch games. Because I don't necessarily know if like some of the frustration that they are experiencing could be related to the unfulfilled like predatory needs. And so with those dogs who aren't experiencing fear and anxiety, I might jump into work around predatory behavior a bit earlier, but largely we still see the same thing, that as those arousal levels drop, as they're coming away from their sympathetic nervous system as a baseline, we tend to see that drop in predatory behavior as well.